40,000 years ago, two completely different kinds of humans walked the same forests. They hunted the same mammoth. They stared at the same stars, and then one of them vanished. Just gone, wiped out, extinct. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. They didn't just meet. They didn't just fight. They had sex. They had children together. And if you're watching this right now, there's a very good chance you're carrying their DNA inside you. Every single person whose ancestors left Africa has between 1 and 4% Neanderthal genes flowing through their veins. That's not speculation. That's hard science from thousands of genetic tests. You might have inherited their immune system, their ability to handle cold weather, maybe even the shape of your nose. So what really happened between us and them? Was it war? Was it love? Was it genocide? Or was it something way more complicated? Today, we're diving into one of the biggest mysteries in human history, the story of what went down when our species, Homo sapiens, met our closest relatives, the Neanderthals. And trust me, this isn't the story you learned in school. So if these stories help you relax or whatever, hit like or subscribe. Also curious where everyone's at, comment your city and time. Reading through last video's comments and seeing Miami, Manchester and Melbourne all in there. The internet's weird, right? Prepare yourself, because the truth is darker, stranger, and way more human than anyone wants to admit. Around 600,000 years ago, humanity split. One group stayed in Africa, slowly becoming us, Homo sapiens. The other group headed north and east, spreading across Europe and Asia. Over hundreds of thousands of years, they adapted to the brutal Ice Age climates. Their bodies changed, their brains grew, they became Neanderthals. Imagine the Neanderthals for a second. Forget everything you think you know. Forget the hunched-over caveman with the club. That's garbage. That image came from a single skeleton of an old man who had arthritis. Scientists in 1908 looked at his bent spine and assumed all Neanderthals walked like that. They were wrong. Real Neanderthals were absolute units, built like professional wrestlers. Males averaged around 5'5" and weighed about 185 pounds, but it was pure muscle. Archaeological studies of their bones show muscle attachment points that would make a bodybuilder jealous. Scientists estimate the strongest Neanderthals could lift over half a ton. Their arm bones were so thick, so dense, you could probably use them as weapons. But here's what's really wild. Their brains were bigger than ours. Not proportionally bigger, actually bigger. The average Neanderthal brain was 1,600 cubic centimeters. Modern humans average around 1,350. The largest Neanderthal brain ever found, from a guy they call Ahmud I, measured 1,736 cubic centimeters. That's one of the biggest human brains ever recorded. Does that mean they were smarter than us? Not exactly. Brain size isn't everything. It's about how the brain is organized. Neanderthal brains were shaped differently. They had massive visual processing areas in the back of their skulls. Makes sense, right? They lived at higher latitudes where winters were dark and brutal. They needed to see in low light conditions, hunt at dawn, track prey at dusk. But all that brain space dedicated to vision meant less space for other things. The frontal areas where modern humans process complex social interactions, where we do abstract thinking, where we plan way ahead into the future, those areas were smaller in Neanderthals. They were smart, no question, but their intelligence worked differently than ours. Their bodies were engineered for power and survival in the cold, short limbs to conserve heat, barrel chests with expanded rib cages that housed enormous lungs. They could breathe in massive amounts of oxygen to fuel their muscles, and those muscles were different from ours too. More fast-twitch fibers, built for explosive strength rather than endurance. They were sprinters, not marathon runners. That massive nose of theirs? Not just for smelling, it was an adaptation to warm, cold air before it hit their lungs. When you're living through Ice Age winters in Europe, you need every advantage you can get. And their faces, oh man, their faces were distinct, massive brow ridges over deep-set eyes, a mid-face that projected forward like someone had pulled their nose and cheekbones away from their skull, no chin to speak of, a bump at the back of the skull called an occipital bun, where powerful neck muscles attached. They looked different from us, but not alien, more like a cousin you'd recognize at a family reunion. These people survived for over 300,000 years in some of the harshest environments on Earth. They lived through multiple ice ages. They hunted woolly mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave bears, animals that could kill you in seconds if you made one wrong move. And they were smart about it. Neanderthals invented a sophisticated stone tool technology called the Mousterian industry. The centerpiece was something called the Levallois technique. Picture this. You take a stone core and carefully shape it from all sides, like you're sculpting it. You prepare it. Then with one precise strike, you knock off a perfect flake already shaped the way you want it. No guesswork, no trial and error. That takes serious planning. You need to visualize the final product before you even start. That's abstract thinking right there. They made specialized tools for specific jobs, scrapers for preparing animal hides, points for spear tips, knives for butchering, awls for punching holes in leather. They had toolkits with up to 40 different types of implements, each one designed for a specific purpose. And here's something that'll make you respect them even more. They took care of each other. Archaeologists have found Neanderthal skeletons showing severe injuries that healed. One guy from Shanidar Cave in Iraq had been smashed in the head when he was young. The injury blinded his left eye and paralyzed the right side of his body. His right arm withered away, but he lived to be 40 years old. Someone fed him, cared for him, protected him. That's not instinct, that's compassion. They buried their dead. No other species before them ever did that. At La Ferracie in France, archaeologists found a rock shelter where multiple Neanderthals had been carefully laid to rest. Some graves had stone tools placed with the body, others had animal bones. And in Shanidar Cave, one burial had pollen from flowers, suggesting they might have been placed on the grave. Whether or not they believed in an afterlife, we can't know, but they clearly felt something for their dead. They marked the moment. They ritualized it. Neanderthals even made art, or at least they probably did. In caves in Spain, archaeologists found red hand stencils and geometric designs painted on walls over 65,000 years ago. That's before modern humans even arrived in Europe. If Neanderthals made these, and the dating suggests they did, then they were doing symbolic thought, abstract representation, art, all on their own. So these weren't dumb brutes. These were people, different from us, sure, but people nonetheless. And then, around 60,000 years ago, something changed. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, started leaving Africa, not in a trickle, in waves, thousands of people pushing north into the Middle East, then spreading east into Asia and west into Europe, Neanderthal territory. For over 100,000 years, the two species had occasionally run into each other in places like the Levant, that region around modern-day Israel and Lebanon. There's genetic evidence of early contact dating back 120,000 years, but those were just brief encounters, skirmishes, temporary overlaps. This was different. This was an invasion. Now imagine you're a Neanderthal living in Europe. Your people have been here for hundreds of thousands of years. You know every valley, every cave, every migration route of the herds you hunt. This is your land, and then strangers show up. They look different, taller, more slender. with weird flat faces and prominent chins. They speak a language you can't understand. They use strange weapons you've never seen before. They move in larger groups than you're used to. What do you do? The archaeological record gives us some clues, and it's not pretty. At sites across Europe and the Middle East, archaeologists find the bones of both species in the same layers. They were definitely occupying the same spaces, at least some of the time. But were they peaceful neighbours? Were they trading partners? Or were they enemies? Here's where it gets dark. There's evidence of violence. Not a lot, but it's there. A Neanderthal skull from Saint-Césaire in France shows a healed fracture from a blow to the head delivered by a sharp implement. Someone hit this person hard enough to crack their skull. They survived, but barely. More disturbing is a rib bone from Shanidar Cave. The bone belonged to a Neanderthal who lived about 50,000 years ago, and embedded in that rib is a wound consistent with being stabbed by a projectile weapon, a throwing spear or spear thrown with a spear thrower, the kind of weapon modern humans had perfected, the kind Neanderthals never developed. The wound started to heal, but the analysis suggests this person died within weeks, probably from lung damage caused by the puncture. So we have what looks like evidence that a modern human killed a Neanderthal with advanced weapons. That's not proof of war, not yet. It's one case, one wound. But it makes you wonder. Researchers have also analysed trauma rates in Neanderthal skeletons and compared them to early modern humans. Surprisingly, both species show similar rates of head trauma and broken bones. Life was violent for everyone back then. Hunting megafauna with primitive weapons was incredibly dangerous. But here's what's interesting. The pattern of injuries is slightly different. Neanderthals show more injuries consistent with close-quarters combat, getting gored by an animal at arm's length, taking a hit while wrestling a prey animal to the ground. Modern humans show different patterns, more distance injuries, more projectile wounds. That makes sense because we developed throwing weapons, spear throwers called atlatls that could launch a dart at 70 miles per hour from 30 yards away. We could kill from a distance. In a fight between Neanderthals and modern humans, that's a huge advantage. Neanderthals were stronger, tougher, built like tanks. In hand-to-hand combat, they'd probably win, but if modern humans could attack from range, using hit-and-run tactics, staying mobile, the fight tips in our favour. And there's another big difference. Group size. Genetic analysis suggests Neanderthal populations were small and widely scattered. They lived in bands of maybe 10 to 20 individuals, limited contact between groups, low genetic diversity, some inbreeding. Modern humans, on the other hand, travelled in larger bands, 30, 50, even 100 people. We had more complex social structures, better communication, wider trade networks. If conflict broke out, we could probably field more fighters. So if there was war, and that's a big if, modern humans had the numbers and the technology. But war doesn't explain everything, because the genetics tell a completely different story. DNA analysis from Neanderthal bones and from modern humans reveals something shocking. The two species had sex, a lot of it. New research published in 2024 narrowed down the timing. The main period of interbreeding happened between 47,000 and 43,000 years ago. Not earlier, not later. One specific window when Neanderthals and modern humans were living in the same regions and producing hybrid children. Every single person today whose ancestry traces outside of sub-Saharan Africa carries Neanderthal DNA. The percentage varies. East Asians have slightly more, around 2 to 3%. Europeans have about 1 to 2%. People from Southeast Asia have less, but everyone has some. That means at some point, Neanderthal genes got into the modern human gene pool and stuck around. And here's what's weird. There's almost no evidence of modern human genes getting into Neanderthal populations. It's a one-way street. Scientists have a few theories why. Maybe hybrid children born to Neanderthal mothers didn't survive as well. Maybe they were raised in Neanderthal groups and went extinct with them. Or maybe, and this is darker, maybe modern human women were producing children with Neanderthal men, but not the other way around. Some of those Neanderthal genes we carry are incredibly important. They affect our immune systems, helping us fight off diseases. They influence metabolism. Some variants affect how our bodies handle cholesterol and fat. Others impact skin and hair color. There's even evidence that some Neanderthal genes affect brain structure, though scientists don't fully understand how. In some cases, Neanderthal genes helped modern humans adapt to new environments faster. We inherited cold weather adaptations, immune responses to local diseases, genetic variants that made survival in Europe and Asia easier. But not all Neanderthal DNA was beneficial. A lot of it got selected out over thousands of years. Natural selection weeded out the harmful variants. Today, even though all non-Africans have Neanderthal ancestry, the actual amount of Neanderthal DNA in any one person is small. So, what does all this interbreeding tell us? It tells us the two species weren't completely separate. They could produce fertile offspring. They were similar enough biologically that their genes could mix. And that changes everything. Think about what that must have looked like on the ground. You're a Neanderthal band moving through southern France. It's late autumn. The herds are migrating. You know where they'll be because your people have hunted these routes for thousands of years. You reach the valley where you always camp. There's a good rock shelter, fresh water, a place your ancestors carved symbols into the stone. But when you get there, smoke rises from the shelter. Strange voices echo off the rocks. And when you approach, you see them. Tall, thin people with unfamiliar faces. They've taken your shelter. What happens next? Maybe you fight. Maybe you negotiate. Maybe, if you're desperate or curious or just human, maybe something else happens. The genetics suggest that whatever happened, it happened enough times that the DNA stuck. We're talking about thousands of successful breeding events over several thousand years. That's not just one or two encounters, that's sustained contact. But here's where things get really interesting. While all that mixing was happening, Neanderthal numbers were crashing. Genetic studies of Neanderthal populations show they were never very numerous to begin with. Estimates suggest maybe 10,000 to 70,000 Neanderthals total at their peak. Compare that to modern human populations that might have numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Small populations are vulnerable. One bad winter could wipe out entire bands. One disease could devastate a region. Neanderthals also showed signs of inbreeding. Their genetic diversity was low. That's dangerous because it means they couldn't adapt quickly to changing conditions. And the conditions were changing fast. Between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago, the climate was incredibly unstable. Temperature swings, dramatic shifts in vegetation, ice sheets advancing and retreating. The animals Neanderthals depended on, those huge Ice Age beasts, they were struggling too. Some scientists think climate change alone could have pushed Neanderthals to the edge, but climate doesn't explain why modern humans thrived in the exact same conditions. We expanded during those same climatic swings. That's where competition comes in. Modern humans had advantages that went beyond just weapons. We had more sophisticated hunting strategies. We used nets and traps. We fished with hooks and spears. We gathered a wider variety of plant foods. Our diet was more diverse. Archaeological sites show modern humans had trade networks that stretched hundreds of miles, shell beads from the Mediterranean showing up at sites in Central Europe, flint from one region being worked at sites far away. That kind of long-distance exchange meant modern humans could buffer against local resource shortages. If one area was starving, you could trade for food from somewhere else. Neanderthals had some trade, but on a much smaller scale. Most of their stone tools were made from raw materials within a few miles of where they were found. Their social networks were smaller, more isolated. That isolation might have been their undoing. Another theory that's gaining traction is disease. Modern humans evolved in Africa, the disease capital of the planet. Tropical regions have more pathogens, more parasites, more deadly microbes than anywhere else on Earth. Our ancestors developed immune systems battle-tested against a huge array of diseases. When we left Africa and spread north, we brought those diseases with us. Neanderthals had never encountered them before. No immunity, no resistance. It's like what happened when Europeans reached the Americas. Native American populations had been isolated for thousands of years. When smallpox and measles arrived, it was catastrophic. 90% death rates in some regions. Entire civilizations collapsed. Could the same thing have happened to Neanderthals? Mathematical models suggest disease could absolutely have been a factor. When two populations that have been separated for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly come into contact, disease exchange is inevitable. And if one population has a heavier disease load, a tropical disease load, that's a weapon more devastating than any spear. The models also show something else interesting. At first, when modern humans and Neanderthals met, there would have been a disease barrier. Both groups would have been vulnerable to each other's pathogens. Moving into enemy territory would have been suicidal. That might explain why it took so long for modern humans to really expand into Europe. We reached the Middle East over 100,000 years ago, but we didn't push deep into Europe until 45,000 years ago. What changed? The answer might be interbreeding. Hybrid children would have inherited immune genes from both species. As those genes spread through both populations, the disease barrier would have lowered. Eventually, there'd be enough immunity on both sides that migration became possible. But here's the cruel twist. If modern humans had more diseases to begin with, we'd reach that tipping point first. We'd be able to move into Neanderthal territory while they were still vulnerable to our pathogens. And once we did, we'd overwhelm them not with spears, but with microbes. They couldn't fight. It's a dark thought. The idea that we might have accidentally genocided our closest relatives with diseases we didn't even know we were carrying. But it fits the timeline. Modern humans expand into Europe around 45,000 years ago. Within 5,000 years, Neanderthals are gone. That's not a lot of time in evolutionary terms. Something dramatic happened. Could violence have played a role? Maybe, probably. There's limited but compelling evidence. Remember that territorial warfare is common in social predators. Lions fight over territory. Wolves defend their hunting grounds to the death. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, wage systematic warfare against neighboring groups. They patrol borders. They launch coordinated attacks. They kill rivals and take their territory. Why would humans be different? Neanderthals were apex predators. They sat at the top of the food chain. Nothing hunted them except maybe cave hyenas or lions, and even those probably avoided healthy adult Neanderthals. So if their population grew too large for the local resources, conflict with neighbouring groups would be inevitable. Archaeological evidence shows Neanderthals had defined territories. They returned to the same caves and shelters generation after generation. They knew their hunting grounds intimately. When modern humans showed up and started using those same resources, conflict would have been natural, not because either side was evil, just because both groups needed the same things to survive. And in that competition, modern humans had the edge, not because we were stronger or smarter in every way, but because we were adaptable. We could change our strategies, we could innovate, we could organize larger groups and coordinate more complex attacks. Some researchers have argued that Neanderthals must have been good fighters too. They resisted modern human expansion for tens of thousands of years. If they were pushovers, we would have overrun them immediately. The fact that it took so long suggests they held their ground. They fought back. They won battles, drove us off, protected their territory. For generations, neither side could gain a decisive advantage. Then something shifted. Maybe it was numbers. Maybe modern human populations reached a critical mass where they could simply overwhelm Neanderthal resistance. Maybe it was technology. The invention of the bow and arrow would have been game-changing. Suddenly you could kill at range with incredible accuracy. Or maybe it was social organization. Modern humans had more complex group structures. We could form alliances between different bands, coordinate attacks involving dozens or even hundreds of people, create sustained military pressure that small Neanderthal groups couldn't match. Whatever the reason, between 40,000 and 35,000 years ago, Neanderthals started disappearing. Region by region, their numbers dwindled. The archaeological record shows modern human sites replacing Neanderthal sites. New tools, new art, new ways of life spreading across Europe. But it wasn't a clean replacement. At some sites we find evidence of overlap. Layers with Neanderthal tools, then layers with modern human tools, then back to Neanderthal, suggesting there was some back and forth. Some sites changed hands multiple times, and at a few sites we find something really interesting. Hybrid tool technologies, stone tools that combine Neanderthal and modern human techniques, as if someone was learning from both traditions. That suggests cultural exchange, maybe even cooperation. At Arcy-sur-Cure in France, archaeologists found a Neanderthal site with shell beads and bone tools typical of modern humans. For years, scientists debated whether Neanderthals made these themselves or stole them from nearby modern human sites. Recent evidence suggests they made them. They were copying modern human technology, learning from us, adapting. That means the relationship wasn't just war, it was complex. Sometimes they fought, sometimes they traded, sometimes they had sex, sometimes they learned from each other. The end result, though, was always the same. Neanderthals lost ground, modern humans gained it. By 30,000 years ago, Neanderthals were almost gone. Only a few isolated populations remained, clinging to survival in places like Gibraltar on the southern tip of Spain, protected by mountains and sea, remote enough that modern humans hadn't fully reached them yet. Those final Neanderthals held out maybe another 2,000 years. Then they too vanished. What was it like being one of the last Neanderthals, knowing your people were disappearing, watching strangers take over your hunting grounds? Did they understand what was happening? Did they have stories about the old days when their people were more numerous? Did they mourn? We'll never know, but it's haunting to think about. The last Neanderthal who ever lived, someone born around 28,000 years ago, grew up in a world dominated by modern humans. They probably never met another Neanderthal outside their tiny band. They were alone, the end of their line, and when they died, an entire species died with them. Except not really, because of that interbreeding, because of those hybrid children born 45,000 years ago, Neanderthal genes survived, not in their own species, but in ours. It's weird to think about. Neanderthals went extinct, but they're also still here, living inside us, a ghost population whose DNA shapes who we are today. Scientists can now map which parts of the modern human genome came from Neanderthals, and it turns out those genes aren't randomly distributed. Some regions of the genome have a lot of Neanderthal DNA. Other regions have almost none. The regions with no Neanderthal DNA are often genes related to fertility and reproduction. That's a huge clue. It suggests hybrid males might have been less fertile or even sterile. Like mules, the offspring of horses and donkeys, mules are usually sterile. They can't reproduce. If male Neanderthal modern human hybrids were sterile or less fertile, that would have limited gene flow. Only hybrid females would successfully pass on Neanderthal genes. Over thousands of years, most Neanderthal DNA would have been weeded out by selection, leaving only the bits that were actually useful. And some of those bits were incredibly useful. Neanderthal immune genes helped modern humans fight off European diseases. Genes affecting skin and hair might have helped us adapt to northern climates faster than evolution alone would allow. One specific Neanderthal gene variant helps people living at high altitudes process oxygen more efficiently. It's common in Tibetan populations, inherited from ancient Denisovans actually, another human species related to Neanderthals. But the mechanism is the same. Ancient human DNA helping modern humans survive in harsh environments. So, in a weird way, absorbing Neanderthal genes made us better adapted to the very regions we were invading. Their evolutionary history, all those thousands of years adapting to Ice Age Europe, that knowledge got coded into their DNA. And when we bred with them, we stole that knowledge. It's like a genetic knowledge transfer. Instant adaptation. Does that make what happened less tragic? Not really. An entire species still went extinct. An entire branch of humanity got cut off. But it complicates the story, makes it less about us versus them and more about us becoming them, absorbing them, merging with them. Some scientists argue Neanderthals didn't really go extinct. They were assimilated, absorbed into the modern human population through interbreeding. Their DNA diluted but never completely lost. From that perspective, we didn't kill them, we became them. But that feels like a comfortable lie, a way to avoid the darker implications. Because the genetic data is clear, gene flow was mostly one-directional. Modern human genes didn't make it into late Neanderthal populations. Neanderthal genes made it into us. That means Neanderthal women were having children with modern human men. Those children survived and thrived in modern human communities. But the reverse wasn't happening, or at least not successfully. Why? Maybe modern human bands were larger and more welcoming. Maybe they absorbed outsiders more easily. Maybe Neanderthal groups were too small, too isolated, too inbred to successfully integrate hybrid children. Or maybe there was violence. Maybe Neanderthal women were taken by force, captured, enslaved. That's an ugly possibility, but warfare between human groups throughout history has often involved exactly that, killing the men, taking the women. It's one of the dark constants of human behaviour. Could modern humans have done that to Neanderthals? Could we have wiped out their males and absorbed their females? The genetics would fit. It would explain the one-way gene flow. It would explain why Neanderthal populations collapsed while modern human populations exploded. And it would make the story of human expansion a lot darker. But we don't have proof, just patterns in the DNA that suggest something asymmetric was happening, something that benefited modern humans and destroyed Neanderthals. Whatever the details, the end result was total. Within 10,000 years of sustained contact, Neanderthals were gone, an entire human species erased from the earth. Modern humans, meanwhile, went on to dominate the planet. We spread to every continent, developed agriculture, built civilizations, eventually reached the moon. Everything we've accomplished since, all of human history, happened because we survived and Neanderthals didn't. But wait. Before we declare this a simple story of winners and losers, let's talk about what makes this really complicated. Because modern science keeps finding things that mess with the narrative. In 2024, researchers published a bombshell study. They sequenced the genomes of Neanderthals who lived around 45,000 years ago, right at the peak of the overlap period, and they found something nobody expected. These Neanderthals had genes that helped them see better in low light, adaptations for cold weather, stronger immune responses to certain diseases, all stuff we figured they'd have, but they also had something else, genes related to brain development that were more similar to modern humans than to earlier Neanderthals. In other words, they were evolving, changing, adapting not just to the environment, but possibly to competition with us. That's not a dumb animal going extinct. That's a species fighting to survive, using every evolutionary tool available. But here's the tragedy. Evolution is slow. It takes thousands of generations to make meaningful changes. Neanderthals didn't have thousands of generations. They had maybe 200 generations between first sustained contact and extinction. Not enough time. Let's talk about their culture for a minute, because this is where things get really emotional. These weren't mindless brutes. They had rich, complex lives. Archaeologists working at Bruniquel Cave in France found something incredible. Deep inside the cave, over 1,000 feet from the entrance, they discovered circular structures made from broken stalagmites. 2 rings carefully constructed, organized, deliberate. The structures were dated to 176,000 years ago, way before modern humans reached Europe. Only Neanderthals were there. Why would they build these? Were they meeting places, ritual sites? We don't know, but somebody spent hours in total darkness, breaking off stalagmites and arranging them in geometric patterns. That's abstract thought, symbolic behavior. Purpose beyond immediate survival. At other sites, we find even more evidence of Neanderthal culture. They used pigments, red ochre and black manganese. They ground these minerals into powder and applied them to shells, to bones, maybe to their own bodies. Why? Decoration, communication, ritual? Again, we don't know for sure, but the behavior itself tells us something profound. They cared about more than just food and shelter. They wanted to make things beautiful. They wanted to mark themselves as different from the animals they hunted. That's human behavior. Deeply human. And then there's the question of language. Did Neanderthals talk? Could they communicate complex ideas? For a long time, scientists argued they couldn't. Their vocal anatomy was supposedly different. Their brains supposedly lacked the right structures. They were supposedly limited to grunts and gestures. But DNA evidence changed everything. Neanderthals had the same version of the FOXP2 gene that modern humans have. That's the gene most closely associated with speech and language development. Mutations in FOXP2 cause severe speech problems in modern humans. If Neanderthals had the same gene, they almost certainly could speak. Maybe not with the same complexity as us. Maybe their vocal range was more limited, but they had language. They could communicate. What did they talk about? What stories did they tell? What names did they call themselves? We'll never know. But it's heartbreaking to think those voices are lost forever. An entire language, thousands of years old, spoken by tens of thousands of people over hundreds of generations, gone, not a single word preserved. When you think about that, the extinction of Neanderthals becomes more than just a biological event. It's a cultural genocide. the death of an entire way of seeing the world. Every Neanderthal who ever lived had thoughts, dreams, fears, loves. They watched sunsets. They mourned their dead. They probably laughed. They definitely felt pain. And we, Homo sapiens, we're the reason they're gone. Whether through violence, disease, or just overwhelming competition, we push them into extinction. That's uncomfortable to sit with, but it's important. Because it tells us something about ourselves, about what we're capable of. We like to think we're special, that we're fundamentally different from other species, that we're moral, ethical, capable of empathy. But when push came to shove, when it was us versus them, we didn't hesitate. We took what we wanted. We expanded into their territory. We outcompeted them for resources. And when they couldn't keep up, we let them die. Some of us had sex with them along the way. Some of those encounters might have been consensual, some definitely weren't, and then we forgot about them. For thousands of years, we had no idea they'd ever existed, until 1856, when workers in Germany found strange bones in a cave, bones that didn't quite look human, but also weren't animal. That discovery changed everything. Suddenly we had to confront the fact that we weren't alone, that other intelligent species had walked the earth, that we shared the planet with relatives we'd helped destroy. The more we learn about Neanderthals, the more human they become, and the more their extinction looks like something we should feel guilty about. But guilt doesn't change what happened. They're still gone. We're still here. So what does that mean for how we think about ourselves? Some researchers argue that studying Neanderthals is actually about understanding human nature, about recognizing that capacity for violence, for genocide, for erasing the other. It's always been part of who we are. Throughout history, humans have committed atrocities against other human groups, different ethnicities, different religions, different tribes. We've enslaved each other, massacred each other, tried to wipe each other out. If we could do that to our own species, doing it to a different species, even a closely related one, would have been easy. The Neanderthal extinction might be the first genocide in human history, but it definitely wasn't the last. That's a dark lens to view our past through. But maybe it's necessary. Maybe understanding what happened 40,000 years ago can help us avoid repeating those patterns now. Because here's the thing, humans today, we're incredibly diverse genetically, culturally, linguistically, but we're all the same species, all Homo sapiens. There are no Neanderthals left to compete with, no Denisovans, no Homo erectus, we're alone. The only human species left. And that loneliness is our own doing. Now let's flip the script for a second, because there's another way to look at this, a less dark interpretation. Maybe what happened wasn't genocide, maybe it was merger, integration, two species coming together and becoming something new. Think about it. Modern humans today aren't genetically pure Homo sapiens. We're hybrids, a mix of African Homo sapiens and Eurasian Neanderthals, with a bit of Denisovan thrown in for some populations. We're literally the product of interspecies mixing. Our genomes are evidence of tens of thousands of encounters between different human species. Some violent, sure, but some must have been peaceful. Some must have been based on genuine connection, because you can't maintain gene flow over thousands of years through violence alone. At some point, hybrid children had to be accepted, raised, integrated into communities. That takes tolerance. It takes openness to the other. It takes seeing past physical differences and recognizing shared humanity. So maybe the story isn't that we destroyed them. Maybe it's that we absorbed them, made them part of us, preserved the best parts of their genome and carried it forward. From that perspective, Neanderthals didn't go extinct. They transformed, evolved, merged with a larger, more successful population. It's still sad that we lost their unique culture, their way of life, their perspective, but at least something of them survived. You can see this playing out in the genetic data. Certain Neanderthal genes are incredibly common in modern populations, not just present, but actively maintained by natural selection. Take immune system genes, for example. When modern humans moved into Europe and Asia, they encountered new diseases, pathogens they'd never faced in Africa. Neanderthals had been dealing with those diseases for hundreds of thousands of years. They'd evolved resistances. By breeding with Neanderthals, modern humans instantly acquired those resistances. It was like downloading antivirus software. Suddenly we could survive in environments that would have killed us otherwise. That's not genocide, that's synergy. Two species combining strengths to create something more adaptable than either was alone. The same thing happened with cold weather adaptations, genes affecting skin tone, hair thickness, metabolic rate. Neanderthals were optimized for Ice Age Europe. Modern humans from Africa weren't, but hybrid children got the best of both worlds. Over generations, natural selection favored people with the right mix of genes for their environment. In northern regions, more Neanderthal genes stuck around. In tropical regions, fewer. That's adaptation in real time. So in a sense, Neanderthals aren't extinct. They're dormant, scattered across the genomes of billions of humans waiting in our DNA. Every time a human baby is born outside Africa, there's a chance they inherit Neanderthal traits, the shape of their skull, the structure of their immune system, the way their brain processes information. Neanderthals live on through us. We're their descendants as much as we're descended from African Homo sapiens. That reframes the whole story, makes it less about extinction and more about evolution, not the end of a species, but a transformation. But even that gentler interpretation has problems, because the archaeological record is clear. Neanderthal sites disappear, their distinctive tool technologies vanish, their way of life ends. Yes, their genes survived, but their culture didn't. And culture is what makes us human. If an alien species came to Earth tomorrow and wiped out all humans, but preserved our DNA in their genome, would that count as survival? Would we be okay with that? Probably not, because what makes us human isn't just our genes, it's our stories, our art, our languages, our accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. All of that died with the Neanderthals, and no amount of preserved DNA can bring it back. So we're left with a complicated, messy story. Not good guys and bad guys, not a simple tale of primitive beings replaced by advanced ones. Just two groups of humans, different but related, competing for the same resources in a harsh world. One group had advantages the other couldn't match: larger populations, better weapons, more flexible social structures, and maybe a heavier disease load that acted like biological warfare. The other group, equally intelligent, equally human, fought and adapted and tried to survive. They succeeded for a while. They even contributed their genes to the winning side. But in the end, they lost. Their unique identity erased, their culture forgotten, their species extinct. It's not a satisfying story. There's no clear moral, no lesson that makes it all make sense, just the brutal reality of evolution and competition. The same forces that created all life on Earth also drove countless species to extinction. Neanderthals were just one more casualty, except they weren't just any species. They were us. Our closest relatives, close enough to breed with, close enough to share dreams and fears and hopes, and we let them die, or we absorbed them, or both. Maybe that's the real lesson, that the line between destruction and integration is thinner than we want to believe, that the same processes can be both genocide and evolution depending on how you look at them. That's uncomfortable, but it's honest. And if we're going to understand what happened 40,000 years ago, We need to be honest, even when it makes us look bad, especially when it makes us look bad. Because the story of Neanderthals isn't ancient history, it's a mirror showing us what we're capable of, both the good and the bad. We're capable of empathy, of caring for the weak, of making art and music and meaning, but we're also capable of incredible violence, of seeing others as less than human, of taking what we want regardless of the cost. Those two sides of human nature have been with us since the beginning, since before we were even fully Homo sapiens, since we were sharing the earth with our Neanderthal cousins, and they're still with us now. So when we ask what really happened between Neanderthals and us, maybe the answer is just that we were human. In all the complicated, contradictory, beautiful and terrible ways that implies. There's a moment in this story that changes everything, a specific time and place where the balance of power shifted irrevocably, and scientists think they've found it. The Levant, that narrow strip of land connecting Africa to Eurasia, modern-day Israel, Lebanon, Syria. 45,000 years ago, this was the frontier, the collision zone where two human species met face-to-face for the first time on a massive scale. Before this, interactions were sporadic, small groups occasionally encountering each other, trading a few genes but not much else. The genetic evidence shows earlier contacts going back over 100,000 years, but those were blips, brief encounters in the vastness of time. This was different. This was sustained contact. Thousands of people from both species living in the same regions, hunting the same animals, competing for the same caves. And something happened there, something that set the stage for everything that followed. Mathematical models of disease transmission suggest that for tens of thousands of years there was an invisible barrier, a disease standoff. Neither species could successfully invade the other's territory because both would get sick. Neanderthals carried pathogens modern humans had no immunity to. Modern humans carried African diseases Neanderthals had never encountered. The Levant became a buffer zone, a narrow strip where both populations coexisted but neither could advance, like two armies facing each other across no man's land. But then something shifted. The barrier started to break down. Why? Probably because of interbreeding. Every hybrid child born was a tiny bridge across the disease divide. They inherited immune genes from both parents. If they survived, they'd be resistant to diseases from both populations, and their children would pass those resistances on. Over hundreds of generations, immunity spread. Slowly at first, then faster, eventually reaching a tipping point where the disease barrier collapsed. Once that happened, modern humans could push forward into Neanderthal heartland, into Europe. And they did. Around 45,000 years ago, modern humans with Upper Paleolithic technology start showing up deep in Europe, France, Germany, Britain, places Neanderthals had controlled for hundreds of thousands of years. The invasion had begun. But Neanderthals didn't just roll over. The archaeological evidence shows they fought back, not with armies or organized warfare in the modern sense, but with everything they had. At some sites, we see Neanderthals adopting modern human technologies, copying our blade-making techniques, creating similar types of tools. That's not surrender, that's adaptation, trying to keep up with competitors who had better technology. It's actually impressive. These weren't stupid creatures blindly following tradition. They could recognize when others had better tools and learn to make them. That takes intelligence, creativity, problem-solving ability, but it wasn't enough. Here's why. The problem wasn't just technology, it was demographics. Modern humans were pumping out babies faster than Neanderthals could replace their dead. Our population was growing, theirs was shrinking. Even without direct violence, even if every interaction was peaceful, the math was against them. Think about it like this. If a Neanderthal band had 10 people and lost 2 in a hard winter, they'd lost 20% of their population. That's devastating. It might take a generation to recover. A modern human band of 50 people losing 2, that's only 4%, barely noticeable. And with more people, there were more potential parents to make up the difference. Over time, those percentages add up. Modern human populations grew while Neanderthal populations stagnated or declined. Eventually, we simply outnumbered them, overwhelmed them, pushed them into smaller and smaller territories. The genetic data backs this up. Analysis of Neanderthal. DNA shows they went through multiple population crashes. Bottlenecks where their numbers dropped dramatically. They'd recover somewhat, but never fully. Each crash left them more vulnerable. Modern humans, meanwhile, were expanding. Our genetic diversity was increasing. We were forming larger social networks, spreading our genes across wider geographic areas. That's the advantage of numbers. More people means more genetic diversity, more brain power, more innovation, more chances for useful mutations to arise and spread. Neanderthals never had that luxury. Their small, isolated populations meant limited genetic mixing, higher rates of inbreeding, less diversity to draw from when conditions changed. When a new disease came through, or a climate shift reduced prey populations, or a particularly harsh winter killed off the elderly and young, Neanderthal bands might not have enough survivors to maintain their culture, to pass on knowledge to the next generation. Anthropologists call this the Toba catastrophe problem, named after a volcanic eruption that supposedly nearly wiped out humanity. Small populations are vulnerable to random disasters. One bad break can be the end. Neanderthals faced bad breaks constantly, and each one left them weaker. But there's another factor we haven't talked about yet, one that might be even more important than disease or demographics: language. Not whether Neanderthals could speak. We've established they probably could, but how complex was their language? How many concepts could they express? How effectively could they transmit knowledge across generations? This is where brain structure becomes crucial. Remember those differences we talked about? Neanderthals having larger visual processing areas but smaller frontal regions. The frontal regions of the brain, especially areas like Broca's area and Wernicke's area, they're critical for language processing, for grammar, for abstract thought expressed through words. Modern human brains have these areas in abundance. Our frontal lobes are massive compared to any other primate. That's what allows us to have incredibly complex languages with elaborate grammatical structures. Could Neanderthals do the same? Maybe, but maybe not at the same level. If their language was simpler, more limited in vocabulary and grammar, that would have huge implications. Because language isn't just about communication, it's about thinking. The words we have shape the thoughts we can think. If you don't have a word for tomorrow, planning for the future becomes harder. If you don't have terms for abstract concepts like justice or possibility, those ideas become difficult to reason about. A less complex language would mean less complex culture, simpler stories, less elaborate teaching methods, reduced ability to pass on accumulated knowledge. And in competition with a species that could communicate everything, that could teach complex skills efficiently, that could coordinate large group actions through detailed planning, you'd be at a massive disadvantage. This might explain why Neanderthal technology stayed relatively static for tens of thousands of years, while modern human technology exploded in diversity and sophistication. It's not that Neanderthals couldn't innovate. They clearly could, but they couldn't transmit those innovations effectively. Each generation had to relearn what the previous generation knew. Progress was slow, inefficient. Modern humans with more complex language could build on the past, stand on the shoulders of giants, each generation adding to what came before. Over thousands of years, that compounds, leads to exponential growth in knowledge and capability. And that's probably what doomed the Neanderthals more than anything else. Not any single weakness, but accumulated disadvantages across multiple domains, slightly worse communication, slightly smaller populations, slightly less adaptable immune systems, slightly more territorial behaviour. Any one of those might not have mattered. Together they were fatal. There's an anthropological concept called competitive exclusion. It says that two species competing for exactly the same resources in exactly the same niche can't coexist indefinitely. Eventually, one will outcompete the other. Even tiny advantages compound over time until one species dominates and the other goes extinct. That's what happened to Neanderthals. They were too similar to us. Occupied the same niche, hunted the same prey, used the same caves. There wasn't room for both. And we had just enough of an edge to win. It probably wasn't obvious at first. Early on, during those thousands of years in the Levant, things might have seemed stable, both species coexisting, neither gaining ground. But the math was always against Neanderthals. Every year, their relative numbers declined just a little bit. Their genetic diversity decreased fractionally. Their range contracted slightly. By the time it became obvious, it was too late. They didn't have the population to mount effective resistance, didn't have the genetic diversity to adapt fast enough, didn't have the communication skills to coordinate a response. They were in a death spiral, and there was no way out. Some of them must have known. In those final generations, the last Neanderthals living in southern Europe, they must have realized they were disappearing. Fewer and fewer bands, longer distances between groups, harder to find mates. Did they understand they were going extinct? Did they have concepts for species death? We don't know, but it's a haunting thought. The last generation of Neanderthals watching their world shrink, knowing on some level that they were the end of the line. And what about us, the modern humans who were there? Did we know we were witnessing the death of another human species? Probably not. To them, Neanderthals were just other people. Different, sure, but people nonetheless. They probably didn't have a concept of species in the modern scientific sense. They just knew that those other people were becoming scarce, disappearing from their traditional territories, eventually gone altogether. Maybe they told stories about them afterwards, the strange people with the heavy brows and powerful builds, the ones who used to live here but don't anymore. Those stories, if they existed, didn't survive. No oral tradition can last 40,000 years. Everything about Neanderthals was forgotten until we dug up their bones. But for a while, in those final centuries of overlap, humans of both species lived side by side, saw each other, knew each other, maybe even cared about each other. Some definitely had sex. Those encounters, whether forced or consensual, created children who carried both species' DNA forward. They're the only reason we know Neanderthals existed at all, apart from fossils. Without that genetic evidence, we might have thought Neanderthals were just another human population, variations within our species rather than a separate species entirely. But the DNA doesn't lie. The differences are too great, too systematic. These were distinct evolutionary lineages separated for hundreds of thousands of years, and yet similar enough to produce viable offspring. That's the paradox at the heart of this story. Different enough to be separate species, similar enough to mix. Where do you draw the line? When does variation within a species become the formation of a new species? The answer isn't clear-cut. Biology is messy. Evolution doesn't care about our neat categories. Neanderthals and modern humans were in that fuzzy zone. Diverged but not completely. Different but not incompatible. Separate evolutionary paths that could still intersect. If things had gone differently, if environmental conditions had favoured Neanderthals instead of us, we might be the ones who went extinct. They might be the ones writing about the strange, flat-faced humans who used to live alongside them. But history doesn't have alternate timelines. There's only what happened, and what happened is that we survived and they didn't. Now we're left trying to understand why, trying to piece together the story from fragments, bones and stones and genes, the archaeological equivalent of reconstructing a murder from a crime scene 40,000 years cold. We'll probably never know the full truth. Too much is lost to time. Too many details erased by millennia of wind and rain and geological upheaval. But we know enough to see the broad strokes, enough to understand that what happened was complicated, not good or evil, just survival, competition, the same forces that have shaped all life on Earth. And maybe that's the most important lesson, that we're not separate from nature, not above it. We're products of it, subject to the same evolutionary pressures as every other species. We like to think we're special, that human morality and culture lift us above mere animal competition. But 40,000 years ago, when it mattered, when survival was on the line, we competed just like any other species, and we won. Let's zoom in on one specific moment, one specific place where we can see the human drama playing out. Saint-Césaire, France. 36,000 years ago, a Neanderthal lived and died here. The bones were found with Châtelperronian tools, that transitional technology that combines Neanderthal and modern human elements. This person's skull shows something chilling. A healed fracture. Someone hit them in the head with enough force to crack bone. The wound healed, but left permanent damage. They survived the attack. But here's the question. Who attacked them? Another Neanderthal or a modern human? We can't know for sure, but the timing is suggestive. This is right when modern humans were pushing into the region, right when competition for resources would have been most intense. If it was a modern human who struck that blow, we're looking at evidence of direct violence between the species. Not war, not organised conflict, just one desperate moment where two different kinds of human came face to face and things got ugly. That's the reality of what was happening across Europe. Not grand battles, not orchestrated campaigns, just small-scale conflicts over hunting grounds, caves, water sources, the same petty violence that has characterized human behavior throughout history. Except this time, it was between species, and it adds up. Enough individual conflicts over enough generations, in enough places, and you get extinction, death by 1,000 cuts. But violence alone doesn't explain the complete collapse. Remember, Neanderthal populations had survived for hundreds of thousands of years. They'd been through climate changes before. They'd competed with other predators. They were survivors. So why did they fail this time? The answer might lie in something we haven't talked about much. Social learning, cultural transmission, how knowledge gets passed down through generations. Modern humans excel at this. We're the ultimate cultural species. We don't just learn from individual experience, we learn from everyone around us, from previous generations. We accumulate knowledge over time. This is called cumulative cultural evolution. Each generation adds to what came before. Over time, you get exponential growth in skills, technologies, strategies. Neanderthals had culture too. They made sophisticated tools, they had traditions, but did they have cumulative cultural evolution at the same level? The archaeological record suggests maybe not. Neanderthal tool technology remained relatively stable for tens of thousands of years. Mysterian tools from 200,000 years ago look similar to Mysterian tools from 50,000 years ago. Modern human technology, by contrast, changed rapidly. Upper Paleolithic tools show tremendous variation and innovation over much shorter time periods, new tool types appearing, old ones being refined, constant innovation. That suggests modern humans were better at social learning, better at transmitting complex information, better at building on past knowledge. And that's a huge advantage in competition. If you can learn from the successes and failures of everyone who came before you, you can avoid mistakes, optimize strategies, invent new solutions to old problems. Neanderthals, with more limited social learning, had to rediscover things each generation. Less efficient, slower progress, more vulnerability to environmental changes. Here's a concrete example. Both species hunted large game, mammoths, bison, deer, dangerous animals that could easily kill you if you messed up. Neanderthals hunted up close, thrusting spears, getting within arm's length of their prey. It worked, but it was incredibly risky. The trauma patterns on Neanderthal bones show they got injured constantly. Broken bones, crushed skulls, gored by tusks and antlers. They were tough enough to survive these injuries, often enough to pass on genes, but barely, and their hunting success probably varied wildly. Sometimes they'd make kills, sometimes they'd go hungry, high risk, inconsistent reward. Modern humans developed different strategies, throwing spears, atlatls, eventually bows and arrows. These allowed us to kill from distance, safer, more consistent, lower injury rates. But more importantly, these technologies required teaching. You can't figure out how to make an atlatl just by looking at one. You need someone to show you, explain the technique, correct your mistakes. That kind of detailed teaching requires complex language, patience, social structures that support extended learning periods. If Neanderthals didn't have that, or had it to a lesser extent, they couldn't adopt these new technologies as easily, couldn't keep up with the innovation. So over time, the gap widened. Modern humans got better tools, better strategies, more efficient hunting, higher success rates, healthier populations. Neanderthals stayed with what they knew, thrusting spears, close quarters hunting, higher injury rates, more people dying young, population growth slowing. The math is brutal. Even small differences in hunting success compound over generations. If modern humans could feed their children just 5% more reliably, that translates to slightly better survival rates, which means slightly more people reaching reproductive age, which means slightly faster population growth. Do that for 1,000 years, and the population differences become dramatic. Add in everything else we've talked about: disease, social learning, group size, communication complexity, all these tiny advantages stacking up, and you get extinction. But here's something that makes it even more tragic. Neanderthals weren't stupid. They knew modern humans had better technology. They tried to adapt. At multiple sites across Europe, archaeologists find Neanderthal contexts with tools that look like modern human designs: blade technologies, bone tools, personal ornaments like beads and pendants. For a long time, scientists debated whether Neanderthals made these themselves or just scavenged them from modern human sites. The question matters because it tells us about their cognitive abilities. Recent evidence suggests they did make them. They were learning from us, copying our techniques, trying to match our innovations. That's not the behavior of a species that's inferior or doomed. That's the behavior of intelligent beings fighting for survival, adapting as best they can. But it wasn't enough. Because innovation requires more than just copying. It requires understanding underlying principles, being able to modify and improve designs, coming up with new applications. Neanderthals could copy. But could they innovate at the same rate? The evidence suggests not. Their versions of modern human tools are often cruder, less refined, missing key features. It's like they got the general idea but couldn't quite grasp the details, or they didn't have the social structures to support the lengthy apprenticeships needed to master complex technologies. Either way, they were always playing catch-up, and in a competition, being one step behind is fatal. There's a modern analogy. Imagine two companies competing in the same market. One has a huge R&D budget, extensive training programs, and massive scale. The other is smaller, more isolated, less able to invest in innovation. The small company might make good products, might even copy the big company's designs. But over time, the big company pulls ahead. Economies of scale, better resources, more brain power applied to problems. Eventually, the small company goes bankrupt, not because they were incompetent, just because they couldn't keep pace. That's what happened to Neanderthals, outcompeted by a rival with systemic advantages they couldn't overcome, and there was nowhere to retreat to. No untapped markets, no unexplored territories where they could rebuild. Modern humans were everywhere, spreading across the old world like a wildfire. By 30,000 years ago, Neanderthals were down to their last refuges. Southern Spain, Gibraltar, isolated pockets where geography provided some protection from the modern human onslaught. But even those didn't last. The final Neanderthal populations disappeared around 28,000 years ago, not with a bang, just fading away, births failing to replace deaths, groups too small to find mates, genetic diversity collapsing. The last Neanderthal probably died alone, or nearly alone, maybe in a small band of 3 or 4, the last remnants of a species that once numbered in the tens of thousands. Did they know they were the last? Did it matter to them? We'll never know. But it's impossible not to feel something thinking about it. Empathy maybe, sadness, recognition of shared humanity. Because they were us. Not metaphorically, literally, the same genus, close enough to breed, close enough that their genes live on in billions of humans today. When they died, part of us died too. And here's the really messed up part. We didn't learn from it. Throughout history, humans have continued doing the same thing to each other, wiping out rival groups, genociding populations that look or sound different. The capacity for violence, for seeing others as less than human, for competition without mercy, that didn't die with the Neanderthals. It's still here, still active, still shaping human behavior. Every genocide, every ethnic cleansing, every systematic attempt to erase another group of people. It echoes what we did to the Neanderthals. The difference is, now we're doing it to our own species, to people who are genetically almost identical to us, people who speak languages we could learn, who have cultures we could understand if we tried. We don't even have the excuse of species difference, just hatred and fear and competition for resources, the same dynamics that drove Neanderthals to extinction. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Not that we're better than Neanderthals, not that we're smarter or more deserving, just that we're more successful, and success in nature is immoral. It doesn't care about fairness or justice. It only cares about survival, reproduction, passing on genes. And in that brutal calculus, we won. Neanderthals lost. End of story. Except it's not the end. Because those Neanderthal genes we carry, they're not passive, they're active, affecting our biology right now. Some of those genes help us, boosting immune function, helping us adapt to different climates, contributing to traits that are useful in modern environments, but some of them might hurt us. Recent research suggests Neanderthal genes are linked to increased risk for certain diseases. Depression, addiction, autoimmune disorders. That makes sense because those genes evolved in a completely different context. Ice Age Europe, Small populations, different diets, different stresses. When you transplant those genes into modern environments, into populations of billions living in cities eating processed food, they might not work as well, might even cause problems. So in a weird way, the story of Neanderthals isn't over. It's ongoing, playing out in hospital rooms and research labs. Every time scientists discover another Neanderthal gene variant associated with disease or health, that's the past reaching into the present. We can't escape them, can't leave them behind. They're woven into our DNA, part of what makes us who we are, and maybe that's appropriate, maybe that's justice. The species we helped destroy lives on inside us, shaping us, influencing us, reminding us, whether we like it or not, that we're not alone in the human family tree. We're hybrids, products of mixing, our genome a living record of ancient encounters between different kinds of human. That should humble us, should make us think twice before dividing humanity into us versus them, because genetically there's no pure us, there's only mixing, always has been. The idea of racial purity, of ethnic separateness, it's a lie. Humans have always mixed, always absorbed, always taken genes from wherever we could find them. Neanderthals are just the most dramatic example, but the pattern repeats throughout history. Populations encountering each other, mixing, creating new combinations. That's the human story. Not separation, not purity, but endless, messy, complicated mixing. And acknowledging that, accepting it, maybe that's how we honour the Neanderthals, by recognising that their legacy isn't extinction, it's us. Now let's talk about what modern science can actually tell us, because in the last 20 years our understanding of Neanderthals has exploded. We're not just digging up bones anymore, we're reading their DNA, reconstructing their genomes, comparing them to ours base pair by base pair, and what we're finding is stunning. In 2024, researchers published a paper analysing ancient DNA from early modern humans who lived 45,000 years ago. These people were alive right at the peak of the overlap with Neanderthals, and their genomes tell an incredible story. These early Europeans had way more Neanderthal DNA than we do today, up to 9% in some individuals. Compare that to the 1 to 4% in modern populations. That's a massive difference. What happened? Why did so much Neanderthal DNA disappear? Natural selection. Over thousands of years, harmful Neanderthal genes got weeded out, removed from the population because they reduced survival or reproduction. But here's what's wild. The process is ongoing. Even today, natural selection is still removing Neanderthal DNA from human populations, slowly, gradually, but measurably. Scientists can track this by comparing Neanderthal gene frequencies across time, DNA from ancient humans versus DNA from people living today. The difference shows which genes are being selected against, and a pattern emerges. Neanderthal genes in certain regions of the genome disappear faster than others, specifically genes related to brain development and testicular function. The brain genes make sense. Neanderthal brains were organized differently than ours. Genes that affect brain structure might not work well in modern human neural development, might cause problems, so they get selected out. The testicular genes are even more interesting. They suggest hybrid males had fertility problems, maybe not complete sterility, but reduced fertility, like mules. That would explain the one-way gene flow. If hybrid males couldn't reproduce well, only hybrid females would successfully pass on Neanderthal genes. Over time, you'd see exactly what we see. Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA disappearing completely because mitochondria are inherited maternally, but nuclear DNA persisting because females could reproduce. It's a subtle form of reproductive isolation, not complete, but enough to limit gene flow, to keep the two species mostly separate even when they were living side by side. And it means the hybrids we're all descended from, those children born to Neanderthal mothers and modern human fathers, or vice versa, they weren't normal. They were probably less fertile, maybe shorter lived, maybe had health problems we can't detect in the bones. Being a hybrid was hard. Most didn't make it. Only a small percentage survived and reproduced, but those who did, their genes spread, and here we are. So what does this mean for how we think about Neanderthals and modern humans as separate species? The classical biological species concept says two populations are different species if they can't produce fertile offspring. Horses and donkeys are different species because their offspring, mules, are sterile. But Neanderthals and modern humans could produce fertile offspring, at least fertile daughters. Does that make us the same species? Not really, because the definition is messier than that. Lots of species can hybridize and produce at least some fertile offspring. Lions and tigers, wolves and coyotes, different species of bears. Hybridization doesn't mean they're not separate species, it just means the barrier between them isn't complete. There's some gene flow, but not enough to merge them into one population. That's what happened with us and Neanderthals. Some gene flow, but the populations stayed distinct until one went extinct. Now scientists are using ancient DNA to ask even weirder questions, like what did Neanderthals actually look like? Not their skulls, their soft tissues, their skin, hair, eyes. And the answers are surprising. Some Neanderthals had red hair, not the same mutation that causes red hair in modern humans, but a different variant that produced a similar colour. So independently, both species evolved redheads. Some probably had pale skin, an adaptation to low sunlight conditions in northern Europe. You need pale skin to synthesize vitamin D efficiently when there's not much sun. Others might have been dark-skinned. Neanderthals were spread across a huge geographic range, from Spain to Siberia. They probably showed variation in skin tone just like modern humans do. We can even start to guess at things like eye colour, hair texture, body odour, because all of these traits are influenced by genes we can now sequence and compare. Some Neanderthals probably smelled different than modern humans, different variants of genes controlling sweat gland function and pheromone production. If you met one, you'd probably notice the smell before anything else, and they might have noticed our smell too. Different but recognizable, close enough to be disturbing. This is the stuff that really brings them to life. Not just bones and tools, but actual physical beings with specific appearances. People you could have looked in the eye and seen personhood staring back. And some modern humans did exactly that. Looked Neanderthals in the eye, saw people, and decided to sleep with them. That's what the genetics prove. These weren't just violent encounters. At least some of them were consensual, maybe even loving. Imagine being a Neanderthal woman meeting a modern human man. He looks different, talks different, uses strange tools, but he's strong, capable, maybe attractive in ways you don't fully understand. Do you see him as human, as a potential mate, or as something other? The genetics say at least sometimes the answer was yes. These two people from different species saw enough similarity to form connections, to have children together. And those children grew up in one community or the other, learned languages, participated in culture, became part of the human story. That's beautiful in a way. Love crossing species boundaries, connection overcoming difference. But it's also tragic because those connections weren't enough to save Neanderthals. Despite interbreeding, despite cultural exchange, despite what must have been thousands of individual relationships, they still went extinct. Love wasn't enough. Understanding wasn't enough. Even genetic mixing wasn't enough. Numbers were enough. Technology was enough. The cold calculus of competition was enough. And now we're left with this weird situation where Neanderthals are both extinct and not extinct. Their species is gone, but their genes remain. Living zombie DNA carried by billions. Some of those genes are doing important things. Scientists have identified specific Neanderthal variants that affect immune response to viruses. Makes sense. Neanderthals lived in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. They encountered viruses modern humans never met in Africa. They evolved defenses. When we bred with them, we stole those defenses, downloaded their antivirus software, and it works. Studies show people with certain Neanderthal immune variants have different responses to viruses like flu and HIV, not always better. Sometimes those variants cause overactive immune responses, autoimmune problems, but sometimes they help, context dependent. The same is true for metabolism genes. Some Neanderthal variants help process fats and carbohydrates differently. Useful if you're eating a high-fat diet in Ice Age Europe. Maybe less useful if you're eating modern processed foods. Scientists are finding Neanderthal gene variants associated with everything from skin thickness to pain perception to circadian rhythms. All little tweaks that made sense in their context but might have different effects now. And here's something mind-blowing. Some of those genes are showing regional variations in frequency. Neanderthal variants that are common in European populations but rare in East Asian populations, or vice versa. That means natural selection is acting differently in different environments. The same Neanderthal gene that's useful in cold climates might be harmful in tropical ones, so it gets selected for in some populations and against in others. We're watching evolution in real time, the slow sorting of ancient genes into modern contexts. 40,000 years later, the legacy of Neanderthals is still being written, but there are darker implications too, because if Neanderthal genes affect disease risk differently in different populations, that has implications for medicine, for drug development, for understanding health disparities. You can't treat everyone the same if they have different genetic backgrounds. If some populations have more Neanderthal DNA affecting drug metabolism, they might need different dosages, different treatments. This is already coming up in medical research. Certain drugs work better in some populations than others. Part of that is Neanderthal genes, ancient DNA affecting modern medicine. It's bizarre, but it's real. The past isn't past. It's literally coded into our cells, affecting us every day. And as we learn more about the Neanderthal genome, we're finding weirder and weirder connections. Neanderthal genes that affect depression risk, addiction vulnerability, even cognitive function. Does that mean Neanderthals were predisposed to these things? Not necessarily. Remember, these genes evolved in completely different contexts, different social structures, different stresses, different everything. Taking a gene that worked fine in a Neanderthal brain and putting it in a modern human brain, that's like installing software designed for one operating system onto a different one. Sometimes it works fine, sometimes it causes glitches. We're still figuring out which is which. But the implications are profound. If part of human mental health is influenced by ancient genes from extinct species, that changes how we think about psychology, about human nature, about what makes us us. We're not just products of our own species evolution, we're products of multiple species evolution. Neanderthals, Denisovans, maybe others we haven't discovered yet, all contributing to the modern human genome. We're genetic chimeras, built from parts with different origins, different histories, different adaptive backgrounds. And that's not a metaphor, it's literal. Your genome is a patchwork, some pieces from African Homo sapiens, some pieces from Neanderthals, all stitched together over thousands of generations of mixing and selection. You're not one thing, you're many things, a mosaic of evolutionary experiments. Some successful, some still being tested, some already failing but not yet eliminated. That should change how we think about human identity, about race, about belonging. Because if we're all carrying DNA from extinct species, if we're all hybrids, then what does it mean to be purely anything? Purely European, purely Asian, purely human? The answers get fuzzy fast. Biology doesn't respect our categories, never has. Species boundaries are suggestions, not laws. And evolution doesn't care about maintaining purity. It only cares about what works. And sometimes what works is mixing. Taking genes from wherever you can find them and cobbling together something new. That's what we are, cobbled together from extinct species and surviving ones, from Africa and Eurasia, from glacial adaptations and tropical ones. We're the species that absorbed everyone else, that took what we wanted and kept moving, that mixed and matched until we created something that could survive anywhere. That's our superpower, not intelligence exactly, not tool use or language or culture. Those are just symptoms. Our real superpower is adaptability, the ability to absorb, to learn, to take good ideas from anywhere and make them our own, to mix genes from different populations and create something new. Neanderthals couldn't do that at the same level. They were more isolated, more conservative, more tied to their traditional territories and ways of life. When conditions changed, they struggled to adapt. We adapted constantly, never met a niche we couldn't invade, never encountered a challenge we couldn't eventually overcome. And part of that adaptation was absorbing Neanderthal genes, taking their cold weather adaptations, their immune responses, their metabolic tricks. We didn't just outcompete them, we consumed them, made them part of us, and moved on. It's brutal, but it's also kind of beautiful, because it means they're not really gone. Not completely. They live on through us in ways they could never have imagined. Here's where things get really weird. Scientists can now create Neanderthal cells in a lab, not cloning them, not bringing them back to life, but taking modern human cells and editing specific genes to match the Neanderthal versions. Then they watch what happens. How do those cells behave differently? How does the Neanderthal gene affect development, metabolism, function? It's like resurrecting tiny pieces of Neanderthals, one gene at a time, one cell at a time. And what they're finding is fascinating. Neanderthal versions of brain development genes cause cells to organize differently, form different patterns, connect in different ways. These aren't huge differences, not like growing a Neanderthal brain, but they're measurable, significant. They show that Neanderthal brains literally worked differently than ours at a cellular level. Does that mean they thought differently? Almost certainly. But how? That's what scientists are trying to figure out. Some researchers are even growing mini-brains, organoids, tiny clumps of brain cells that develop in dishes. They can edit these to have Neanderthal genes and see how they grow compared to normal human versions. It sounds like science fiction, but it's happening now, in labs around the world. We're slowly reconstructing what made Neanderthals unique, what made them different from us. And with each discovery, the picture gets more complex, more nuanced, less about simple comparisons of better or worse, more about different strategies, different solutions to the problem of being human, because that's what this is really about, different ways of being human. Neanderthals weren't failed humans. They were successful humans, just successful in different ways, adapted to different environments, optimized for different challenges. They survived for over 300,000 years. That's longer than modern humans have been around. They were doing something right. The fact that they went extinct doesn't diminish that. Extinction is normal. 99.9% of all species that ever existed are extinct. It's the default outcome. The weird thing isn't that Neanderthals went extinct. It's that we didn't. So far. Because here's the thing, we're not immune to extinction, we're not special, we're subject to the same forces that wiped out Neanderthals. If a new disease emerged that we couldn't fight, we could collapse just like they did. If climate change disrupted our food supply, we could starve just like they did. If we faced competition from something better adapted, we could be outcompeted just like they were. The only reason we're still here is we haven't faced that perfect storm yet, but eventually we will. Maybe in 1,000 years, maybe in 1,000,000, but eventually something will challenge humanity in ways we can't overcome. And when that happens, will we go extinct? Or will we do what we did with Neanderthals? Mix with whoever's better adapted, absorb their genes, survive by transforming into something new. Because that's the other option. Not extinction, not survival, but evolution into something else. We're already doing it. Human-directed evolution, CRISPR gene editing, designer babies, genetic engineering. In 50 years, humans might be able to choose which genes their children have, including whether to keep or remove Neanderthal variants. Want better immune function? Keep this Neanderthal gene. Want to avoid depression risk? Remove that one. We could edit ourselves, optimize ourselves, become something better suited to whatever challenges we face. Is that still human, or is it something new, a different species entirely? The lines are blurring, just like they blurred between Neanderthals and modern humans. Just like they've always blurred throughout evolution. There's no pure human. No perfect form we're supposed to maintain, just constant change, constant adaptation, constant mixing and reshuffling of genes. And maybe that's the real lesson from Neanderthals, that holding on to identity too tightly is dangerous, that refusing to change is suicide, that survival requires flexibility, adaptation, willingness to become something new. Neanderthals couldn't adapt fast enough. We could, at least so far. But the future is uncertain. The world is changing faster than ever. Climate, technology, population, resources, all shifting in ways we can't fully predict or control. Will we adapt fast enough, or will we end up like Neanderthals, the dominant species that suddenly wasn't? There's another possibility, though, one that's even weirder. What if we don't stay on Earth? In 100 years, humans might be living on Mars, on orbital habitats, on moons of Jupiter, spread across the solar system, adapted to different environments, different gravities, different radiation levels. Those populations will diverge. Genetically, physically, culturally, over thousands of years, they'll become different enough to be different species. Will they all still be human, or will humanity split, become multiple branches again, like it was 40,000 years ago when Neanderthals and Denisovans and Homo sapiens all coexisted? And if they do split, will they compete? Will space humans and Earth humans come into conflict over resources? Will we repeat the whole cycle, one branch outcompeting the others, driving them to extinction? Or will we learn from history, avoid the mistakes we made with Neanderthals? Find ways to coexist, to maintain diversity instead of collapsing into monoculture. These aren't hypothetical questions, they're challenges we might face in our lifetimes, or our children's lifetimes. The story of Neanderthals isn't ancient history, it's a preview, a warning about what happens when closely related human groups come into competition. Sometimes one wins, sometimes both lose. Rarely does everyone survive unchanged. But here's the hope. We know this now. We understand the dynamics. We can see the patterns that led to Neanderthal extinction. Can we use that knowledge to avoid repeating it? Can we build systems that allow different human populations to coexist without one dominating the others? Can we value diversity instead of seeing it as threat? Can we celebrate difference instead of trying to erase it? These are moral questions as much as scientific ones. Questions about what kind of species we want to be, what values we want to uphold, what future we want to create. Neanderthals can't answer those questions. They're gone, but their ghosts live in our DNA, reminding us of what we've done, of what we're capable of, both the mixing and the destroying. Every person walking around with Neanderthal genes is a living monument, a reminder that we're not alone in the human story, that other branches existed, that they mattered, and maybe, just maybe, that knowledge can make us better, more humble, more aware of our place in the larger web of life. Because we're not the end point of evolution. We're just one more step, one more experiment, one more attempt by biology to find solutions to the problem of survival. Neanderthals were an experiment too, a successful one for a long time, until they met us. What happens when we meet our next competitor? Not another human species. Those are gone, but artificial intelligence, bioengineered organisms, space aliens if they exist. Will we compete, cooperate, mix? What will happen to humanity when we're not the smartest thing on the planet anymore? The Neanderthal story suggests it won't be pretty. Competition between intelligent species tends to end badly for one of them, usually the one with fewer numbers, less adaptability, worse communication. Are we Neanderthals or modern humans in that scenario? Are we the ones who'll win or the ones who'll go extinct? Nobody knows, but the answer probably depends on how we act, the choices we make, the values we uphold. If we cling to human purity, if we refuse to mix or change or adapt, if we see others as competitors to be destroyed rather than partners to learn from, then yeah, we're the Neanderthals. But if we do what modern humans did best, if we adapt, mix, absorb, learn, become something new, then maybe we survive, transform, evolve into whatever comes next. The choice is ours. The future is unwritten, but the past is clear, and it tells us that survival requires flexibility, that purity is death, that mixing is strength. Neanderthals are inside us, their genes, their adaptations, their evolutionary history. We're not separate from them. We're their continuation, and that's beautiful, because it means they won too, not in the way they probably wanted, not as a distinct species maintaining its identity through time, but as part of something larger, something that survived when they couldn't, something that carried their genes to every corner of the globe. There are more Neanderthal genes alive today than at any point in Neanderthal history, because there are 8 billion humans carrying fragments of their genome. That's their legacy, not extinction, but transformation, dissolution into a larger whole, sacrifice of identity in exchange for immortality. Is that comforting? I don't know, but it's true. And it changes how we should think about them, not as losers, not as evolutionary dead ends, but as ancestors, contributors, part of the team that created modern humanity. We wouldn't be who we are without them, literally. Our genomes would be different, our immune systems weaker, our adaptations less complete. They gave us gifts, probably without meaning to, probably without even understanding what was happening, but they gave them nonetheless. And now it's on us to honour that. to remember them, to learn from their story, to avoid the mistakes that led to their extinction, to build a future where difference doesn't mean destruction, where competition doesn't require annihilation, where multiple forms of intelligence can coexist. That's the challenge. That's what we need to figure out. Because the next time humanity faces what Neanderthals faced, we might not be the ones with the advantages. We might be the ones struggling to adapt, fighting to survive, watching our world shrink. And when that happens, we'll understand what Neanderthals felt. The fear, the confusion, the desperate attempt to hold on to identity in the face of overwhelming change. Will whoever comes next show us mercy? Will they preserve our genes? Will they remember us? Or will we be forgotten, erased from history except as fossils, as curiosities, as extinct species that once had potential but couldn't keep up? The answer depends on how we act now, the precedents we set, the values we embody, the future we create. Neanderthals couldn't choose. They didn't have the knowledge we have, didn't understand the forces working against them, couldn't see the big picture. We can, we do, we have no excuse. So what are we going to do about it? That's the question the Neanderthal story leaves us with, not what happened to them. We know that, but what happens to us? What kind of future we create? What legacy we leave? Will we be the species that learned from the past, that found ways to coexist with difference, that survived through adaptation and mixing and flexibility? Or will we be the species that repeated old mistakes, that clung to purity and identity until it killed us, that chose destruction over transformation? The choice is ours, and the clock is ticking, because evolution doesn't stop, change doesn't pause, and somewhere out there, something is coming that will challenge us like Neanderthals were challenged. Maybe it's AI, maybe it's climate change, maybe it's something we can't even imagine yet, but it's coming. And when it arrives, we'll face the same test Neanderthals faced. Adapt or die. Change or vanish. Mix or perish. They chose their path, or maybe they didn't have a choice. Maybe circumstances chose for them, but we have a choice. We have knowledge, we have technology, we have awareness of what's possible. So let's choose wisely. Let's honour the Neanderthals not with monuments or memorials, but with actions, with creating a world where their story doesn't repeat, where diversity thrives instead of dying, where being different isn't a death sentence. That's how we remember them. That's how we make their sacrifice mean something, not by preserving the past, but by building a better future, a future where no human species ever goes extinct again, where we all survive by becoming something new together, where mixing isn't weakness but strength. That's the world Neanderthals never got to see, the world they helped create but couldn't live in. Let's make sure we do better. Let's make sure their genes, living in billions of humans, get to see a future worth living. That's what they deserve, and that's what we owe them. The story of Neanderthals and us isn't over. It's still being written every day in every human carrying their DNA. What happens next is up to us.